Strange Playgrounds by George Daniel Lee. The Last Sane Man, read by John Wood. At long last, the train had been delayed 4 times, pushed back from 2 p.m. to 2:45 p.m, from 2:45 p.m. to 3:10 p.m, and finally to fucking 4 p.m. after a platform change that prompted a human stampede. He took a moment to bask in the regulated warmth, England's autumnal chill leaching from his bones. The frosts had come early this year, and there was, as ever, talk of substantial snow that would likely never materialise. Looking out of the window, he saw people already gathering for the next train. The common masks of worry and impatience they wore lent them to the look of some obscure religious congregation, come to worship at this temple of dirt and diesel-stinking transition. He turned away, occupying himself with the tales of distant atrocity that he'd forget before reaching journey's end. More chaos in the Middle East, American envoys targeted by Muslim terrorists in India, Iran and Saudi Arabia. At home, a man arrested for having his son and daughter chained up as dogs in the basement, where they'd spawned a brood of inbreds, most of whom likely wouldn't survive long enough to be ferried into foster care. Henry folded up the newspaper and shoved it down the side of his seat. Not bad enough that the public had to be constantly bombarded with that shit, but did the reporters have to go about conveying it with such glee? Not that he could claim innocence in that regard. After all, he hadn't stopped reading, had he? Couldn't leave the stories unfinished, regardless of their subject. He was too tired for this sort of self-flagellation. The last few days had taken it out of him, pretending to be interested in relatives he hardly ever saw. By the end, he'd begun to understand why people idolised actors so much. Pretending to be what you weren't was fucking hard work. Still, at least he'd paid his dues. Wouldn't have to waste thought or energy on it for at least another couple of years. A little black girl, no older than 5, hair tied in fetching buns to either side of her head, appeared in the aisle next to him, staring, as if he'd spontaneously sprouted horns and begun to draw fire. Fuck it. Why couldn't people keep their kids under control? Hello there. He waved half-heartedly. The girl continued to stare in silence, lowering her head slightly to peer at him from beneath the dark sickles of her eyebrows. "Kelly, you come here and leave the man alone." The mother's tone made it clear that she wasn't calling her daughter away for the man's benefit. He might as well have been a lump of dog shit she'd stopped to examine. The girl lingered for a split second, familiar enough with the elasticity of her mother's patience to know how far she could stretch it, then darted away, trailing giggles down the carriage. Henry watched the world outside the window sift by. God, it felt like he'd been on the train for hours. Familiar fields, swamps and distant forest land, a world he'd known since childhood, when he and Mum came visiting Nan and Grandad, but from which he'd always been separated. As a kid, once the glamour of I Spy and word association games soured, he'd imagined what it'd be like to run there in the mist and sludge. There were always monsters where his imagined self wandered, great worms erupting from beneath the soil, lumbering marsh things composed of sludge and stinking vegetation. His sinuses stung with nostalgia at the memories. How the monsters would always trail him to Nan and Grandad's house, where he'd make a deeper game of them, occupying himself with daydream horrors till nightfall, when he was reluctantly shepherded to bed. "Tickets from Nottingham." He jolted as if disturbed from sleep, turning to face the ticket man, who stood waiting patiently in the aisle. "Sorry, mate," he smiled from behind his beard. "Wake you up, did I?" A young Indian man, scalp shaved bald, beard hanging in streamers to the level of his shoulders. "Nah, it's okay," Henry replied, fumbling in his pocket for the tickets. "Just daydreaming." The guy barely checked the ticket before stamping it through. "I'll let you get back to it then. Just be sure to wake up before you reach your stop." "I will," Henry promised, returning his attention to the window. Déjà vu, Henry laughed to himself. The house in the distance served as a marker on the train journeys he'd taken as a child. Mum always pointed it out, proclaiming that she, Nan and Grandad used to live there when she was a girl. A large farmhouse, long since abandoned and left to ruin, its surrounding fields become overgrown wasteland through years of neglect. As a kid, he'd entertained dreams of living there when he grew up. Now the thought of blundering about a farmstead was laughable. Funny thing, he could have sworn he saw it go by a little while back. Maybe a different farmstead. There were quite a few out here, and he was tired. He'd likely dozed off for a little while, dreams and memory intermingling. Already starting to get dark. God, he hoped he arrived back in Birmingham before the last of the light bled away. Early evening was the worst possible time to be hanging around New Street, when the thugs and the crazies crawled from their holes. The little black girl appeared again. Despite her mother's disinterested warnings, she'd spent the last 5 minutes running up and down the aisle, singing snippets of nursery rhyme and pop song. She'd acquired a lollipop since her last encounter, undoubtedly a means of temporarily plugging the hole capable of so much cacophony. Hello again. She smiled around her treat, offering him a sticky-fingered hand to shake. Before he could accept, a woman he presumed to be her mother, young, kempt, professionally attired, materialised, glaring at him, as if he was something she'd scraped from the heel of her shoe before turning on her daughter. What have I told you about leaving people alone? Henry felt that the subsequent smack was unnecessary, especially seeing the girl's smile crumple beneath it. Sorry, the woman grunted, making it sound more accusatory than apologetic. That's okay, he began, but she and her daughter were already gone. He knew it was coming. He just couldn't believe it. The fields, with their slopes and rises, the odd lake, quarry and patch of forest. The farmhouse. Look, Henry, Mum used to live there with Nan and Grandad. Yes, he knew. Fucking ghost in his skull. What he didn't know was how this could be the third time they'd passed it by in what felt like close to an hour. An hour? Surely that couldn't be right either. They definitely should have arrived by now. His watch informed him that less than 5 minutes had passed since he boarded the train. Jesus. He watched till the farmhouse was out of view, watched till the fields gave way to gravel pits, industrial sites and man-made quarries. All right, calm the fuck down. Obviously been dreaming or something. Stop working yourself up over nothing. He fished the newspaper from beside his seat, turning to the puzzle page. Not much of a distraction, his eyes straying back to the window, daring the world beyond to repeat itself a fourth time. It was only too happy to call his bluff. Tears of sheer confusion stung his eyes as reason wrestled with what they relayed. They were going nowhere, cycling over the same stretch of track again and again. How was that possible? People would have noticed if the train had started doubling back on itself. It didn't make any fucking sense. A little down the aisle, a digital display cycled through the train's route. Nottingham, Derby, Burton-on-Trent, Tamworth. ETA 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Only 6 minutes. Then he'd be fine. A warm wave of relief washed his entrails at the sight of the ticket man approaching. He looked harassed, eyes carrying the weary sheen of a man out of love with his work. "Excuse me." The man stopped in his tracks, not smiling. "Yes?" "Is there, something wrong with the train?" The man's brow furrowed, lips turning down at the corners. "How do you mean, mate?" "Well, I've noticed we keep passing the same places over and over again. I was wondering—" Now there was a smile, more frustrated than amused. "Nah, man, I think you've got the wrong end of the stick. But we've been travelling for, what, half an hour or more? It should only take 10 minutes to get to Derby." The smile died again. "Sorry, mate." The ticket man shook his head. "Don't know what you're on about. We only left Nottingham a few minutes ago. It'll be a little while before we get into Derby." Henry noticed others turning attention to the exchange, a sudden muteness descending over the carriage as people lowered their voices and strained their ears. He didn't know what to say. Part of him shrieked, No, you're wrong. Look out the window and tell me I'm imagining things." But the rest reined it in, knowing how crazy it'd make him look. "Just sit tight," it admonished. "Give it a few minutes. Things will work themselves out." "Okay," Henry nodded, doing his best to sound self-deprecating. "I don't know. Maybe I was just dreaming or something." "Don't worry about it," the ticket man smiled, though not with his eyes, moving on. This time he'd keep watching till either the farmhouse rolled around again or they arrived at Derby Station. At least that way he could be sure in his own mind. Quarries, gravel pits, industrial sites, fields, hills, forests, a river, a lake, the fucking farmhouse. Henry felt everything inside descend several levels, as if some fundamental foundation had been removed, leaving all that it supported to crumble. The display still read the same. Next stop, Derby, ETA, 6 minutes. He couldn't recall the last time he'd felt like this, like a lost and lonely child, not knowing what to do save sit and cry. No, he wasn't a bloody child anymore. He was going to do the adult thing and find out what the hell was going on. In front sat a well-dressed woman in her late 50s, idly leafing through a fashion magazine. "Excuse me?" "Oh!" she exclaimed, looking round at him. "You nearly frightened me to death. I was a bit engrossed. Sorry. Listen, I was wondering if I could ask you something." The woman raised an eyebrow, folding up her magazine, clearly intrigued. "Ask away." "This is going to sound... Could you just look out of the window for me?" She regarded him a beat longer, trying to get the measure of him. "All right. What are we looking for?" "A farmhouse. I'll point it out when it comes round." It was a few minutes before it did. The woman's response was one of frustrated disappointment. "Well, what about it? We've already passed it at least 5 times. I'll prove it to you. Just keep looking out the window. I swear you'll see it again in a few minutes or so." She looked doubtful and a little afraid, but settled down to watch. "There!" Henry exclaimed, unable to keep a note of hysteria from his voice. "You see it?" The woman turned to him with a befuddled smile, eyes vacant. "Yeah, so what?" "What do you mean, so what? We only saw it a few minutes ago. Don't you want to know why we keep passing the same damn place all the time?" "Okay," she spoke delicately. "I don't know what this is all about, and frankly, I don't care. Leave me alone, please, or I'll be calling the guard." What? What the fuck was this? His imagination flew into overdrive. Had he been set up by one of those fucking candid camera shows? If so, he'd gladly sue those responsible into financial oblivion. This wasn't fucking funny. "Look," he started, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. "I don't know what's going on either, but we've already been on this train, what, an hour now? And we haven't even pulled into Derby yet. Don't you think that's weird?" "An hour?" she replied, shaking her head. "Are you on something? It's only been about 5 minutes since we left Nottingham. Just leave me alone, will you?" "Is there a problem?" The ticket guy again, all trace of bonhomie or patience evaporated. "Yeah, there's a problem. This lunatic keeps bothering me with some crap about the train going round in circles, and I've already told him to leave me alone. Listen, mate, just sit and stop bothering people, all right? Or I'll have to put you off at the next stop." Henry laughed, knowing that it probably confirmed his craziness. "That'd be absolutely bloody fine by me if we ever fucking get there. Listen, we're just going round and round the same stretch of track. We've passed the same fucking farmhouse 5 fucking times now, and I want to know what the fuck's going on." He felt eyes on him, heard muted whispers from all around the carriage. The conductor rolled his eyes, sighed. "Listen, mate, have you taken something? Because you'll have to get off at Derby if you have." Henry breathed deep, trying to compose himself. "No, I haven't taken anything. I'm telling you, this train isn't going anywhere. Look, just sit down and shut the hell up, will you?" This from a burly man a few seats up the carriage who'd risen and was glaring at Henry with murder in his eye. "You're upsetting folk." He turned to the little black girl, who was sat in her mother's arms, looking like she might burst into tears. Henry relented, sinking down in his seat. "Fine, we'll just stay here forever." "Fine by me, as long as you keep quiet and leave people be," the conductor warned. 1, 2, 3, 4 more times he watched the farm sail by, the sky neither lightening nor darkening, suspended in perpetual twilight. Henry had ample time to sit and think about his situation. Just suppose this was something bigger, weirder than he'd imagined. Suppose the train had entered some kind of time warp, it and everything it contained ticking over the same reel of events again and again, except him. The thought of going round and round forever, never aging, changing, dying, made him feel nauseous. Or maybe there was something wrong with the universe, a fundamental mechanism broken or backfired, leaving time and space in a state of disarray, all too fucked up for him to get his head around. Only one thing was certain. He had to get off this damn train. Getting up, he felt eyes on him like wasps beneath his clothes as he weaved his way down the aisle. "Where do you think you're going?" the man from earlier demanded. "To the toilet, if that's all right with you." The man's eyes flashed. "Just so long as you know, if you shoot up any more shit in there, I'll throw you off this train myself." Henry just laughed. The emergency stop mechanism was near the doors, behind a sheet of breakable plastic. A part of him reacted violently to the notion of even touching it, a lifetime of conditioning by teachers, parents, the glaring green and white warnings on the walls, penalty for improper use, up to £500 fine, resulting in a taboo that equalled incest in repulsiveness. But what was that transgression weighed against being stuck here forever? He'd never so much as thrown a slap in anger before, let alone a punch. His fist rebounded off the plastic, a yelp coming with sudden pain. Shit! Through the window, he saw the farm sailing past again. Was that a light flickering one of the upstairs windows? "Oi! What the bloody hell are you doing now?" The ape from before, out of his seat and striding down the aisle towards him. Henry didn't waste time or breath on explanations. He simply turned and ran. "Hey, stop him! The bloody guy's nuts!" Most didn't move to comply, instead doing their damnedest to ignore him in hope that he might return the courtesy. Several glanced up in fright-eyed surprise as he stumbled by, one or two demanding explanation. Behind, his pursuer drew closer, grunting as he manoeuvred his bulk down the aisle. The train was barely 4 carriages long. He had seconds before running out of places to run. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the farmhouse passing again, the light in its windows unmistakable now, as if a fallen star blazed inside. A confusion of fumbles and cursing from behind. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw his pursuer barrel into someone getting out of their seat, attempting to ease his way past whilst the man demanded apologies. A little way ahead, 2 others had risen, making their way towards him. What could he do or say that wouldn't simply compound their impression of him as a lunatic? Nothing. They'd already made up their minds, decided that he needed putting down. Tears of frustration stung his sinuses as he looked back the way he'd come. His pursuer had already disentangled himself, and now the conductor appeared behind, expression grim and condemning as the rest. Nowhere to run, a cornered animal whose remaining heartbeats amounted to little more than seconds. Then he saw it. The open button on the nearby door, its lights blinking, inviting him to press. He'd never seen them active whilst a train was in motion before, though he'd often wondered what would happen if some electronic malfunction made them so. All it'd take was for someone to lean against it, and the doors would slide open, sucking everyone in the vicinity to their deaths. "Hey, mate!" The men from the carriage paused a few feet away. One stood forward from the other, smiling and holding out his hand as if coaxing a suicide from the edge of a cliff. "How's about we all just sit down, yeah? People are getting pissed off with it all now." Even if he did press the button, what was he going to do? Jump out of a moving train? Best case scenario? He'd smash his skull or snap his neck and die quickly. The worst? "Look," he tried again, doing his utmost to sound calm, reasonable, and failing. "I know how this sounds, but I've watched the same damn farmhouse go by at least 10 times now. There's something weird about this train." The men exchanged glances, unconvinced. "Well, we'll probably be able to sort it out at the next stop, if you just sit down." Henry laughed, letting tears come. "There isn't going to be a next stop." He pushed the button. The doors hissed, slid aside, a blast of wintry air flooding the carriage. Through the windows continued to show the same relentless reel of countryside. Beyond the doors was darkness, subterranean, absolute. Gazing into it, hearing the whispers that sounded beyond the clatter of wheels on rails, Henry realised it wasn't him who'd lost his mind. It was the rest of the world. They couldn't see, even as they rushed forward, reaching to restrain him, hands closing on empty space. Henry fell, the train's clatter receding. Voices rushed in to replace it, singing, whimpering, shrieking stories that he didn't know, but which would become intimately familiar before his descent ended. In time, he'd even add his own to the mythology. telling it to those who came after. It began with a scream.